March 23, 2024. Rural Pennsylvania, 15 miles outside the small town of Greenfield. A place where farmland stretched for miles, where old barns stood against the sky like monuments to a fading way of life. Michael Carson, a real estate developer from Philadelphia, had purchased the old Morrison farm at auction 1 month earlier. The property was 120 acres of overgrown fields, collapsing outbuildings, and a farmhouse that hadn't been occupied in years. The previous owner, Harold Morrison, had died in October 2022 at age 87, leaving no heirs and a property so neglected it had taken 16 months for the estate to settle. Michael's plan was simple: survey the land, clear the structures, and subdivide the property into smaller parcels for residential development. Rural Pennsylvania was seeing an influx of people fleeing crowded cities, looking for space and quiet. This property, despite its current condition, had potential. On March 23rd, Michael hired a drone surveying company to map the entire property. The company, Precision Aerial Solutions, used advanced drones equipped with high-resolution cameras, thermal imaging, and ground-penetrating radar. These tools could identify underground utilities, map terrain with remarkable accuracy, and detect subsurface anomalies that might affect development plans. The drone operator, Jennifer Hayes, launched her equipment at 9 a.m. The morning was clear, and cold, perfect conditions for aerial survey work. The drone hummed as it rose above the Morrison property, its cameras capturing thousands of images, its sensors recording data that would be processed into detailed maps. Jennifer monitored the drone's progress from her laptop, watching the real-time feed as the device flew grid patterns over the property. Most of what she saw was unremarkable: overgrown fields, a collapsing barn, the empty farmhouse, scattered equipment, rusted beyond recognition. Then, at approximately 10:30 a.m., the thermal imaging sensor detected something unusual. In a wooded area about 200 yards behind the main barn, partially hidden by decades of forest growth, there was a heat signature pattern that didn't match natural terrain. It was subtle, but Jennifer's software flagged it as anomalous. She switched to ground-penetrating radar mode and directed the drone to make a second pass over the area. The GPR readings confirmed what the thermal imaging suggested: there was something buried approximately 3 feet below the surface. The radar signature showed 2 distinct masses, roughly human-sized, positioned parallel to each other. Jennifer called Michael immediately. "You need to see this," she said. "I think there might be something buried on the property. Could be old septic tanks or buried debris, but the signatures look unusual." Michael drove out to the property within an hour. Jennifer showed him the thermal images and GPR data. Michael, who'd developed dozens of properties and seen plenty of buried surprises, felt a chill run down his spine. "Those look like bodies," he said quietly. By 2 p.m. that afternoon, the Pennsylvania State Police were on site. By 4 p.m., forensic anthropologists from the State Medical Examiner's Office had arrived. By the following morning, March 24th, a full forensic excavation team was carefully removing earth from the wooded area behind Morrison's barn. The excavation took 3 days. This wasn't crude digging. It was archaeological precision. Forensic technicians used small brushes, trowels, and handheld tools to remove soil centimeter by centimeter, photographing and documenting every step. Stakes were placed around the site to mark grid coordinates. The earth was sifted, examined, preserved as evidence. On March 26th, the full picture emerged: 2 complete skeletal remains, buried side by side in a grave approximately 3 feet deep. But it wasn't just that they were buried together. It was how they were positioned. The skeletons were facing each other. Their arms, or what remained of them, were positioned as if embracing. The skeletal hands overlapped, fingers intertwined. They'd been laid to rest, or placed, in a position that suggested intimacy, protection, a final embrace that had lasted 10 years in the dark Pennsylvania soil. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead forensic anthropologist, stood at the edge of the excavation site and felt tears prick her eyes. She'd worked hundreds of cases, examined countless remains, but this struck something deep. Whoever buried them, she said to the detective standing beside her, wanted them to be together. Before we continue with this mystery, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened on September 13, 2014, involves a couple celebrating 50 years of marriage. A journey that should have ended in joy, but instead ended in tragedy. By the end, you will understand how a simple car trouble on a rural road led to a horror that remained hidden for a decade. The questions investigators faced were heartbreaking. Who were these people? How had they ended up buried on Harold Morrison's property? And most haunting of all, why had they been positioned in an embrace, as if whoever killed them wanted to preserve some final gesture of love even in death? The skeletal remains were transported to the state medical examiner's office in to Harrisburg. Dental records and DNA analysis would be needed to confirm identity, but investigators already had a strong suspicion. They'd reviewed every missing persons case in Pennsylvania from the past 20 years, focusing on cases involving couples who'd disappeared without a trace. One case stood out: Emily and David Rodriguez, who'd vanished on September 13, 2014, while driving to their 50th wedding anniversary celebration. The Rodriguezes had lived in Greenfield, just 15 miles from where the remains were discovered. Their disappearance had been one of the most publicized missing persons cases in central Pennsylvania in the past decade. Within 48 hours, dental records confirmed what investigators suspected. The two skeletons found embracing in that shallow grave were Emily Marie Rodriguez and David James Rodriguez. To understand the magnitude of this loss, you need to understand who Emily and David were. Not just names in a case file. Not just victims. They were people who'd built a life together spanning half a century, who'd raised a family, who'd meant something to their community. Their story began long before that terrible September day. Emily Marie Sullivan was born in 1946 in Greenfield, Pennsylvania, the second of 4 children born to an Irish Catholic family. She grew up in a time when Greenfield was a thriving small town, when factories provided good jobs, and Main Street was busy with shops and restaurants. Emily was a bright student, popular but not in a superficial way. People were drawn to her warmth, her genuine interest in others, her ready laugh. She had auburn hair that turned copper in summer sun, green eyes that sparkled when she smiled, and a dusting of freckles across her nose that she never quite outgrew. She stood 5 feet 3 inches tall, petite but strong, the kind of woman who could work all day without complaint. She wore her faith openly, but without judgment, volunteered at her church, helped elderly neighbors, babysat for young mothers who needed a break. David James Rodriguez was born in 1943 in nearby Harrisburg, the son of a Puerto Rican father and an Irish mother. His mixed heritage made him something of an outsider in 1940s Pennsylvania, but his easy smile and athletic ability helped him navigate the social complexities of the era. He stood 5 feet 10 inches tall, with dark hair, warm brown eyes, and a quiet confidence that people found reassuring. David moved to Greenfield in 1961 when his father got a job at the local steel mill. David was 18, had just graduated high school and was planning to attend community college to become a teacher. Emily was 15, still in high school, when they met at a church social that summer. David volunteered to help organize the event. Emily was there with her youth group. Their eyes met across a gymnasium decorated with streamers and balloons, and something clicked. David waited until Emily turned 16 to ask her on an official date. They went to a movie, a comedy that neither of them could remember later because they'd spent the entire time talking in whispers, learning about each other, discovering the 1,000 small things that made them compatible. By the time Emily graduated high school in 1964, they'd been dating for 2 years, and everyone in Greenfield knew they'd end up married. They wed on June 20th, 1964, in a small ceremony at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Greenfield. Emily wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit. David wore a suit he'd saved 3 months to buy. They honeymooned for a weekend at a cabin in the Pocono Mountains, then came home to a small apartment above the hardware store on Main Street to begin their life together. David worked as a substitute teacher while completing his education degree at night. Emily worked as a nurse's aide at a Greenfield hospital, a job she loved because it let her help people. Money was tight those first years, but they were happy. They had each other. They had plans. They had a future stretching ahead of them. Their first child, Robert, was born in 1966. Their daughter, Maria, arrived in 1968. Their youngest, Thomas, completed the family in 1970. 3 children in 4 years made life chaotic, but Emily and David navigated parenthood the way they navigated everything, together, with patience and humor and unwavering support for each other. David eventually secured a permanent position teaching high school English at Greenfield High School. Emily, once the children were all in school, returned to her education and became a registered nurse, working in the pediatric ward at the hospital. They bought a modest house on Maple Street in 1973, a 3-bedroom ranch with a backyard where the kids could play. The Rodriguez family became fixtures in Greenfield. David coached Little League Baseball. Emily volunteered with the PTA. They attended every school play, every sports game, every parent-teacher conference. Their home was the one where neighborhood kids congregated, where the door was always open, where there was always something to eat and someone to listen. But what people remembered most about Emily and David was how they were together. After 5 years of marriage, they still held hands. After 10 years, they still looked at each other with affection. After 20 years, they still made each other laugh. After 30 years, they still treated each other with the courtesy and respect that some couples lose after months. I've never seen 2 people more devoted to each other. Their daughter Maria would later tell investigators, "My whole life, I watched them be partners. Not just husband and wife, but genuine partners. They made decisions together. They supported each other's dreams. They never spoke badly about each other, not even in small ways. Growing up, I thought all marriages were like that. I was an adult before I realized how rare what they had was." By 2014, Emily and David had been married for 50 years. David had retired from teaching in 2009 at age 66, after 42 years in the classroom. Emily had retired from nursing in 2011 at age 65, after 35 years at the hospital. They'd planned their retirements together, wanting to finally have time to travel, to visit their children and grandchildren without work schedules interfering, to simply enjoy each other's company without the demands of careers. They had 3 adult children. Robert, 48, an engineer living in Pittsburgh with his wife and 2 teenage sons. Maria, 46, a social worker in Philadelphia, married with 3 children. Thomas, 44, who'd followed his father into teaching, living in Harrisburg with his wife and 2 young daughters, 7 grandchildren total, ranging in age from 6 to 17, all of whom adored their Nana Emily and Pop David. At 68, Emily had silver hair she wore short and practical, laugh lines around her eyes, and hands that showed the years of nursing work. She still volunteered at the hospital 2 days a week, helping in the pediatric ward, reading to sick children, offering comfort to worried parents. She was active in her church, part of a quilting group that made blankets for homeless shelters, always baking something for someone's birthday or celebration. At 71, David had kept most of his hair, though it had gone completely white. He wore reading glasses and had developed a slight paunch from Emily's cooking. But he was still active, still walked 3 miles every morning, still sharp-minded and engaged with the world. He volunteered as a literacy tutor at the public library, helped former students with college application essays, and was writing a memoir about his years teaching that he hoped his grandchildren would someday read. They lived simply in retirement. The house on Maple Street was paid off. Their needs were modest. They spent their money on visits to see their children and grandchildren, on the occasional weekend trip to historical sites David wanted to visit, on gifts for others more than for themselves. Their 2010 Honda Accord had 90,000 miles on it, but ran perfectly well. They saw no need to replace it. For their 50th wedding anniversary, Emily and David didn't want a big fuss, but their children insisted on celebrating. Robert, Maria, and Thomas organized a party at the Greenfield Country Club, inviting family and friends, planning an evening of dinner, dancing, and toasts to a marriage that had become a model for everyone who knew them. September 13, 2014, was chosen because it was a Saturday, easiest for out-of-town family to attend. The party was scheduled to begin at 6 p.m. Emily spent the week before helping plan the menu, insisting she didn't need anything fancy, just wanted everyone together. David let his children handle the details, though he did request that the DJ play their song, the one they'd danced to at their wedding 50 years earlier. On the morning of September 13th, Emily woke early and made David his favorite breakfast: scrambled eggs with cheese, wheat toast, and strong coffee. They ate together at their kitchen table as they'd done for 50 years, talking about the party that evening, wondering if all the grandchildren would behave, laughing about how strange it felt to be celebrating 50 years when it seemed like just yesterday they were newlyweds in that apartment above the hardware store. At 4 p.m., they began getting ready. David put on his good navy suit, the one he wore to weddings and funerals, with a white shirt and a tie that Maria had given him for Father's Day. Emily wore a dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion, a lovely blue that brought out what remained of the color in her eyes, with a string of pearls David had given her for their 40th anniversary. At 4:30 p.m., they walked out of their house on Maple Street. Emily carried a small purse. David had the car keys. They were smiling, excited, ready to celebrate 50 years of marriage with the people they loved most. They never arrived at the party. By 6:30 p.m., when they still weren't there, their children began calling, their cell phones. No answer. By 7 p.m., Robert drove to the house on Maple Street. The house was locked, lights off. Emily and David were gone. By 8 p.m. that evening, while guests at the country club stood around in confusion and growing concern, Emily and David Rodriguez were already dead, buried in a shallow grave behind a barn on Harold Morrison's farm, positioned in each other's arms, together in death as they'd been in life. September 13th, 2014, a late summer day in Pennsylvania, warm but not oppressively hot, with a hint of autumn in the air. The kind of day that felt full of possibility, perfect for a celebration. Emily and David Rodriguez left their home on Maple Street at 4:30 p.m. Their daughter Maria had called at 4:15 p.m., confirming they were on their way. "We're leaving in 15 minutes, David had said. "Tell everyone not to start without us." The drive from Maple Street to the Greenfield Country Club should have taken approximately 30 minutes. The route was straightforward. North on Main Street, turn right onto Route 22, follow it for 12 miles, turn left onto Country Club Road, and arrive at the venue. Emily and David had driven this route dozens of times over the years. David knew every turn, every landmark. At 4:32 p.m., according to later reconstruction of their movements, Emily and David backed out of their driveway. A neighbor, Mrs. Patricia Walsh, who lived across the street, was watering her garden, and waved to them. They waved back. Mrs. Walsh would later tell police that they looked happy, dressed up, excited. Emily called out that they were going to their party. Mrs. Walsh remembered. "She said she'd tell me all about it tomorrow. I said to have a wonderful time. That was the last thing I ever said to her." At approximately 4:40 p.m., Emily and David's Honda Accord was seen by two different witnesses traveling north on Main Street, passing through downtown Greenfield. The car was moving normally, no indication of any problems. David was driving. Emily was in the passenger seat. Both witnesses knew the couple and waved. At approximately 4:55 p.m., the Rodriguez's car was captured on a traffic camera at the intersection of Main Street and Route 22. The image would later be analyzed by investigators. David at the wheel, Emily beside him, both visible through the windshield, both appearing normal and untroubled. After that, nothing. The trail went cold. Somewhere, between that traffic camera and the country club, Emily and David Rodriguez vanished. At 6 p.m., when guests began arriving at the Greenfield Country Club, Robert Rodriguez started checking his watch. His parents were punctual people. Being late would be unusual. At 6:15 p.m., he called his father's cell phone. It rang but went to voicemail. He called his mother's phone. Same thing. At 6:30 p.m., Robert began to worry. He called his siblings. Maria tried calling her parents' cells. No answer. Thomas drove to Maple Street to check if they were still at home, perhaps having lost track of time. The house was dark, cars gone. At 7 p.m., Robert called the Greenfield Police Department to report his parents missing. The dispatcher took the information, but explained that adults had to be missing for 24 hours before an official missing persons report could be filed unless there was evidence of immediate danger. Robert insisted something was wrong. His parents would never miss their own anniversary party without calling. Something had happened. The dispatcher, recognizing the Rodriguez name and knowing David's reputation as a longtime teacher, agreed to send a patrol car to drive the route from the Rodriguez home to the country club, looking for their vehicle. At 7:20 p.m., Officer James Mitchell located the Honda Accord. The car was on the shoulder of County Road 47, a rural two-lane road that connected Route 22 to Country Club Road. It was a less traveled, alternate route, but one that locals sometimes use to avoid traffic on Route 22. The car was pulled off onto the grass shoulder, hazard lights still flashing, driver's door slightly ajar. Officer Mitchell approached the vehicle cautiously, calling for backup as he did so. The car was empty. The keys were still in the ignition. Emily's purse was on the passenger seat, her cell phone inside it. David's phone was in the center console. The car showed no signs of damage, no flat tires, no evidence of mechanical failure. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. The car simply sat there, abandoned, its occupants gone. Officer Mitchell searched the immediate area, walking the road shoulder for a quarter-mile in both directions, calling out for Emily and David. No response, no sign of them. At 7:45 p.m., he called for additional units and a supervisor. By 8 p.m., 6 police vehicles were on scene. By 8:30 p.m., Greenfield's volunteer fire department had arrived to assist with searching. By 9 p.m., the Pennsylvania State Police had been notified and were coordinating a larger search operation. The search that night covered a 2-mile radius from where the car had been found. Officers, firefighters, and volunteers walked the roadsides with flashlights, checked nearby fields and wooded areas, knocked on doors of the 3 farms within that radius, asking if anyone had seen an elderly couple. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. Emily and David Rodriguez had simply disappeared. Investigators processed the Honda Accord as if it were a crime scene, because by this point, everyone involved realized that's what it might be. The car was towed to a state police garage where forensic technicians examined every inch of it. They found nothing suspicious. No blood, no signs of struggle, no fingerprints other than those that should be there. The car had approximately half a tank of gas. The engine showed no signs of overheating or mechanical problems. When technicians tried to start it, the engine turned over immediately. There was no reason the car should have been stopped on that rural road. The only unusual detail was the position of the gear shift. The car was in park, as would be expected, but the emergency brake hadn't been engaged, which David always did when parking. It was a small detail, possibly meaningless, but investigators noted it. It suggested the car had been stopped quickly, or that David hadn't intended it to be a permanent stop. At 3 a.m. on September 14th, the search was temporarily suspended until daylight. At 6 a.m., it resumed with even more resources. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras flew grid patterns over the area. Search and rescue dogs tracked Emily and David's scent from the car, but the trail led only a short distance before the dogs lost it, suggesting the couple had gotten into another vehicle. Dive teams were brought in to search a small creek that ran near where the car had been found, on the possibility that Emily or David had wandered away from the car, perhaps disoriented or having a medical emergency, and fallen into the water. The creek was thoroughly searched. Nothing was found. By September 16th, 72 hours after the disappearance, over 200 volunteers had participated in searches. Every field, every wooded area, every structure within 5 miles of where the car was found had been checked. Emily and David Rodriguez remained missing. As the physical search continued, detectives began investigating other possibilities. The working theory was that someone had intercepted Emily and David, either forcing them off the road or approaching them after they'd stopped for some reason. But who? And why? Detectives interviewed Emily and David's children extensively, building a comprehensive picture of the couple's life, looking for any hint of motive or explanation. The interviews revealed what everyone already knew. Emily and David were beloved. They had no enemies. They weren't wealthy. They weren't involved in anything controversial. They were simply a retired nurse and teacher living a quiet life. Investigators examined the couple's finances. Nothing unusual. Modest retirement accounts, Social Security income, no large withdrawals, no suspicious transactions, no debt, no financial problems that might explain someone targeting them. They reviewed the couple's phone records. The last calls made on David's phone were to his children that week, coordinating details about the anniversary party. Emily's last call was to a friend, discussing what to wear to the party. Nothing suspicious. They interviewed everyone on the guest list for the anniversary party. Over 80 people. Everyone expressed shock and horror. No one had any information that helped explain what had happened. No one reported seeing Emily and David's car on the road that evening. No one had received any strange calls or messages. Detectives looked into David's former students and Emily's former patients, wondering if someone from their past held a grudge, some perceived wrong that had festered into violence. They found nothing. David's former students remembered him as a fair and inspiring teacher. Emily's former patients and their families remembered her as kind and competent. They investigated the possibility of carjacking. Perhaps someone had forced Emily and David out of their car, intending to steal it, and something had gone wrong. But the car had been left behind, keys in the ignition. If this was a carjacking, why abandon the vehicle? They considered the possibility of a random act of violence, what law enforcement calls a crime of opportunity. Someone saw an elderly couple on a rural road and decided to rob them or worse. But there was no evidence of robbery. Emily's purse with her credit cards and cash was still in the car. David's wallet, found later in his pocket by forensic examination, had contained $230 and was untouched. The 3 farms near where the car was found were all investigated. Detectives interviewed the property owners, walked the properties with consent, looked in barns and outbuildings for any sign that Emily and David had been there. All 3 farmers cooperated fully, allowed searches of accessible structures. However, the searches in 2014 were visual inspections, not excavations. Officers walked properties looking for freshly disturbed earth, obvious signs of burial, or evidence on the surface. The wooded area behind Morrison's barn, overgrown and dense with vegetation, showed no obvious signs of recent digging. The forest floor was covered in years of accumulated leaves and undergrowth. Without specific cause to believe bodies were buried there, and without ground-penetrating radar or cadaver dogs focused on that specific area, the shallow grave remained undetected. One of those farms was owned by Harold Morrison. Detectives interviewed him on September 15, 2014. Morrison was 79 years old at the time, a widower who'd lived alone on his property since his wife died in 2008. He was described by neighbors as quiet, somewhat reclusive, but not unfriendly. He told detectives he'd been home all afternoon on September 13th, but hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. He'd allowed officers to walk his property and inspect his barn and outbuildings. The search was visual, looking for obvious signs of the missing couple. Nothing suspicious was observed. Detectives ran background checks on all 3 farmers, standard procedure. 2 had completely clean records. Harold Morrison had a DUI conviction from 1982 and an assault charge from 1976 that had been dismissed. The assault charge had involved a physical altercation with a neighbor over a property line dispute. Morrison had allegedly struck the neighbor with a shovel handle during a heated argument. The charges were dropped when the neighbor, who sustained minor injuries, declined to press charges, and the matter was settled privately. It was decades-old history, not unusual for rural areas where disputes sometimes escalated, but it established that Morrison had a history of resorting to violence when angry or threatened. As weeks became months, the investigation shifted from active search to cold case. Tips still came in occasionally. Someone would call reporting they'd seen an elderly couple matching Emily and David's description in another state. Each tip was investigated. None led anywhere. The prevailing theory among investigators was that Emily and David had been abducted, possibly killed, and their bodies hidden somewhere that searchers had missed. The rural area around where their car was found was vast, full of fields and forests and ravines where bodies could be concealed. It was a painful reality, but investigators had to accept it. Without a break in the case, without new evidence, Emily and David Rodriguez might never be found. For the Rodriguez family, the not knowing was torture. Robert, Maria, and Thomas organized their own searches on weekends, walking the roads near where their parents' car had been found, posting flyers, pleading on local news for anyone with information to come forward. They hired a private investigator. They put up a reward, $25,000 for information leading to finding Emily and David. Nothing came of it. In December 2014, 3 months after the disappearance, a memorial service was held at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Greenfield. The church was packed. Over 500 people attended, including David's former students and Emily's former patients. There was no funeral because there were no bodies to bury. Just a service to honor and remember, to gather as a community and share grief. Emily and David's house on Maple Street remained exactly as they'd left it. Robert, as executor of his parents' estate, paid the bills and maintained the property, but couldn't bring himself to sell it or even go through their belongings. "It feels like giving up," he told his siblings, "like we're admitting they're not coming back." In 2017, 3 years after the disappearance, the court declared Emily and David Rodriguez legally deceased. This was necessary for the family to settle the estate, collect life insurance, move forward with the legal realities of death. But legally dead is different from actually knowing what happened. The family still had no answers, no closure, no justice. Years passed, the case remained officially open, but with no active investigation. The file grew dusty in storage. Greenfield moved on, though longtime residents never forgot. The Rodriguez case became shorthand for an unsolved mystery, a tragedy that had no resolution. And all that time, less than 2 miles from where their car had been found, Emily and David Rodriguez lay in a shallow grave behind Harold Morrison's barn. They'd been there since the evening of September 13th, 2014, positioned in each other's arms, together in the darkness, waiting to be found, waiting for justice, waiting for someone to finally see them and bring them home. The decade between Emily and David Rodriguez's disappearance and the discovery of their remains was marked by a family's persistent hope, battling against fading probability. For Robert, Maria, and Thomas Rodriguez, life split into 2 irreconcilable timelines. The world where their parents existed somewhere, somehow, and the world where they had to accept that Emily and David were gone. Robert, the oldest at 48 when his parents disappeared, took the loss hardest. As a son, he felt he should have protected them, though rationally he knew there was nothing he could have done. As executor of their estate, he dealt with the painful logistics of death without bodies. Every decision felt like betrayal. Every form he signed. Declaring them deceased felt like giving up. He kept their house on Maple Street, maintained, but empty. Once a month, he'd drive from Pittsburgh to Greenfield, unlock the door, and walk through rooms frozen in time. His mother's reading glasses on the coffee table. His father's coffee mug, still in the dish drainer from that last morning. The blue dress Emily had planned to wear to the party hanging in the closet because she'd already been wearing it when she left. Robert continued the anniversary searches. Every September 13th, he'd organize a group, usually just family and a few close friends by this point, and they'd walk the roads near where the Honda Accord had been found. They'd carry updated flyers with age progression photos showing what Emily and David might look like now, though after a few years, everyone knew the age progression was pointless. If Emily and David were still alive, they would have made contact. Maria, the middle child, processed her grief. Through activism, she lobbied for better resources for families of missing persons, testified before the state legislature about the need for more funding for cold case investigations, started a support group for families dealing with similar tragedies. It was her way of making meaning from meaninglessness, helping others when she couldn't help her own parents. She struggled with the ambiguity. At least if we knew what happened, we could grieve properly, she told a reporter in 2017. We could bury them. We could have a place to visit. But this not knowing, this permanent maybe, it's like a wound that can't heal because it's always being reopened. Thomas, the youngest, threw himself into teaching. He taught English at the same high school where his father had spent 42 years. He walked the same hallways, taught in the same classroom. Former students of David would occasionally reach out to Thomas, sharing memories, telling him what his father had meant to them. These stories were both comfort and agony, reminders of what had been stolen. The 7 grandchildren grew up in the shadow of their grandparents' disappearance. The older ones, who'd known Nana Emily and Pop David, carried clear memories. Sunday dinners, birthday parties, Christmas mornings when Pop read "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" in funny voices. The younger ones knew their grandparents only through photographs and stories, mythical figures who'd vanished like characters in a fairy tale. Greenfield never completely forgot. On milestone anniversaries, local newspapers would run retrospective articles. 5 years since Rodriguez's disappearance, still no answers. 10 years later, what happened to Emily and David Rodriguez? The articles would recap the basic facts, interview the family, note that the case remained open but unsolved. The police department kept the case file accessible. Every few years, a new detective would review it, hoping fresh eyes might spot something previous investigators missed. Nothing new ever emerged. The case was simply one of those mysteries that defied explanation, where a couple had vanished in broad daylight on a well-traveled road and left no trace. Various theories persisted in the community. Some people believed Emily and David had been killed by someone passing through, a random act of violence by a stranger who'd never been connected to the crime. Others thought someone local was responsible, someone who knew the back roads and knew how to hide bodies in the rural Pennsylvania countryside. A few people clung to the possibility that Emily and David had chosen to disappear, though this theory made no sense given their deep connections to family and community. The most chilling theory, whispered but never proven, was that one of the 3 farms near where the car was found held the answer. But all 3 properties had been searched in 2014. Nothing had been found. The theory persisted anyway, because humans need explanations, need to believe that answers exist somewhere, even if they're inaccessible. Harold Morrison, the farmer whose property would eventually yield Emily and David's bodies, died in October 2022 at age 87. He'd lived alone on his farm since his wife's death in 2008, becoming increasingly reclusive in his final years. Neighbors rarely saw him. He had his groceries delivered. He didn't attend church or community events. He was simply the old man on the old farm, someone people knew about but didn't really know. Morrison died of a heart attack, alone in his farmhouse. He wasn't discovered until 3 days later, when a postal worker noticed mail piling up and contacted authorities. He had no living relatives, no will, no specific instructions for his property. His estate went into probate. The Morrison farm sat empty for approximately 16 months, while lawyers sorted through the complexities of an intestate estate with no heirs. The house deteriorated. The barn, already in poor condition, continued its slow collapse. The fields grew wild. The property became one of those abandoned places that rural areas accumulate, eyesores that neighbors complain about, but no one quite knows how to address. In February 2024, Morrison's estate was finally settled and cleared for sale. The property was sold at auction to Michael Carson, the Philadelphia developer who saw potential in the land's location and size. Carson had plans to subdivide, to transform the forgotten farm into new housing for people seeking rural life. His first step was the drone survey, standard procedure for any development project. Map the property, identify any issues, plan the work. It was supposed to be routine. Instead, it would finally answer a question that had haunted central Pennsylvania for nearly 10 years. The forensic excavation of the grave site behind Harold Morrison's barn began on the morning of March 24th, 2024. The area had been secured by state police, marked off with yellow crime scene tape. A tent was erected over the site to protect it from weather and prying eyes. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead forensic anthropologist, assembled her team. 4 additional anthropologists, 2 forensic technicians, a photographer, and an evidence collection specialist. This wasn't a job to be rushed. Every centimeter of soil removed might contain evidence. Every bone, every artifact, every detail mattered. The excavation was documented exhaustively. Overhead, photographs were taken before any digging began, establishing the scene. The area was divided into a grid, each square carefully mapped. Then, slowly, the team began removing earth. The bodies had been buried approximately 3 feet deep, which in forensic terms is considered a shallow grave. Deep enough that animals were unlikely to disturb them, but not so deep that digging would have been overly difficult or time-consuming. This suggested the burial had been done by one person or a small group, probably in a hurry, but with enough time to do a reasonably thorough job. As earth was carefully removed, the skeletal remains began to emerge. First, the tops of 2 skulls, positioned close together. Then, as more soil was removed, the full picture became visible. 2 complete human skeletons, lying side by side, facing each other. What made the scene remarkable, what made even experienced forensic investigators pause, was the positioning. The skeletons weren't just lying parallel. They were arranged in an embrace. The arms were positioned so that the bones overlapped, as if in life the 2 people had been holding each other. The hands, or what remained of them, were intertwined. "This is intentional positioning," Dr. Chen said to Detective James Walsh, who was overseeing the investigation. "Whoever buried these people placed them this way deliberately. Bodies don't naturally fall into this position. This was staged." Over 3 days, the remains were carefully excavated, photographed from every angle, and documented. Forensic analysis would take weeks, but immediate observations were noted. Both individuals appeared to be older adults based on skeletal development and wear patterns on bones and teeth. Both showed signs of trauma to the skull, specifically blunt force trauma, that would have been fatal or near fatal. The trauma patterns suggested they'd been struck from behind, possibly with a heavy object like a pipe or bat. Personal effects were found with the remains, with what appeared to be the male skeleton, a wedding ring on the left hand's ring finger bone, a watch with a broken crystal but still identifiable as a Timex, and fragments of clothing including what seemed to be suit fabric, a tie, and dress shoes, with what appeared to be the female skeleton, a necklace identified as a pearl strand still around the neck bones, a small silver cross on a chain, fragments of a blue dress, a single earring. The pearl necklace was the detail that made Detective Walsh's blood run cold. He'd reviewed the Rodriguez case file before coming to the scene. Emily Rodriguez had been wearing a pearl necklace when she disappeared, a gift from David for their 40th anniversary. The detail had been noted in the missing persons report. Dental records were requested for Emily and David Rodriguez on March 25th. The state medical examiner's office compared them to the skeletal remains on March 26th. The match was definitive. The couple buried in each other's arms behind Harold Morrison's barn were Emily Marie Rodriguez and David James Rodriguez, missing since September 13, 2014. The Rodriguez children were notified on March 27th. Robert, Maria, and Thomas drove together to the state police barracks in Harrisburg to hear officially what they'd already been told. Their parents had been found. They were dead. They'd been murdered. How? Robert asked Detective Walsh. What happened to them? Walsh explained what forensic evidence had revealed. Emily and David had died from blunt force trauma to the head, struck from behind, probably killed quickly. They'd been buried together, positioned in an embrace, likely within hours of their death. They'd been in that grave for nearly 10 years, less than 2 miles from where their car had been abandoned, on property that had been searched in 2014, but not thoroughly enough. Who did this? Maria asked. Was it Morrison? That was the question investigators were working to answer. Harold Morrison was dead, couldn't be questioned, couldn't be charged if evidence implicated him. But he'd owned the property where the bodies were found. He'd been alive when Emily and David disappeared. He'd been interviewed in 2014 and claimed to know nothing. Was he lying? Had he killed them? If so, why? Investigators obtained a warrant to search Morrison's farmhouse, even though Morrison was deceased, and the property now belonged to Michael Carson. They were looking for any evidence connecting Morrison to the Rodriguez murders, weapons, personal effects belonging to Emily or David, anything that might explain what had happened. The search took 2 days. Morrison's house was a time capsule, filled with decades of accumulated possessions. Investigators found financial records, personal correspondence, photographs, tools, but nothing that directly connected Morrison to Emily and David Rodriguez. What they did find was troubling context. Morrison's financial records showed he'd been in dire financial straits in 2014. He was months behind on property taxes, facing foreclosure. He'd taken out multiple loans, all in default. He was a desperate man, which sometimes makes people dangerous. They found evidence of Morrison's violent past. The 1976 assault charge hadn't been his only incident. There were complaints from neighbors over the years about Morrison's temper, his threats, his erratic behavior. Nothing that had risen to criminal charges, but a pattern of a man who could be volatile when provoked. In Morrison's barn, the one near where Emily and David were buried, investigators found something significant. When forensic technicians applied luminol to the interior walls and floor, areas near a support beam showed positive reactions indicating the presence of blood residue. Even after 10 years, in the protected environment of the barn's interior where rain and sun couldn't reach, luminol could detect hemoglobin traces. The pattern suggested someone had been struck while standing, blood spatter traveling upward and outward in a way consistent with blunt force trauma. Subsequent testing confirmed the presence was human blood, though DNA analysis was complicated by degradation and contamination from the barn environment. The theory that emerged from evidence was this: Emily and David Rodriguez, driving to their anniversary party on County Road 47, experienced car trouble. Forensic examination of the Honda Accord recovered in 2014 had noted that while the engine started when tested, there were signs of a cooling system issue that might have caused temporary overheating. This detail, overlooked at the time because investigators were focused on finding Emily and David alive, became significant in hindsight. On a warm September afternoon, an older vehicle with a marginal cooling system could overheat, especially on rural roads where speeds are lower and airflow reduced. Emily and David likely pulled over when the temperature gauge climbed, waited for the engine to cool, then found themselves unsure whether it was safe to continue to their important event or if they needed help. Morrison's farm was visible from where their car was found, less than a quarter-mile away. David, raised in an era when neighbors helped neighbors, might have decided to walk to the farm and ask to use a phone or request assistance. Emily, dressed in her formal attire and uncomfortable leaving the car unattended on a rural road, likely accompanied him. Morrison, desperate for money and facing foreclosure, might have initially engaged normally with them. But perhaps he saw Emily's jewelry, David's quality suit, assumed they had money. Perhaps he demanded cash, and they refused or tried to leave. Perhaps David said something that triggered Morrison's volatile temper. The exact spark doesn't matter. What matters is that Morrison made a choice. He attacked them, probably in his barn based on the blood evidence. The blunt force trauma suggested he'd struck them from behind, first one and then quickly the other. Emily and David had died together, or nearly together, probably without understanding what was happening or why. Then Morrison had faced the practical problem of bodies. He couldn't leave them in the barn. He couldn't put them in their car and drive them somewhere. Too risky. So he buried them on his own property, in a wooded area behind the barn, where the ground was soft enough to dig, where trees and undergrowth would hide any evidence of disturbed earth. But here's what haunted investigators and what would later be discussed endlessly in media coverage. Morrison had positioned Emily and David in an embrace before covering them with soil. He'd taken the time to place them face to face, to intertwine their hands, to preserve in death some echo of the love they'd shared in life. Was it guilt? Remorse? Some twisted sense that if he had to kill them, he could at least let them be together? Or was it mockery, a final cruelty? No one would ever know. Morrison had taken his motivations to his own grave. The discovery of Emily and David Rodriguez's remains and the implication of Harold Morrison, deceased in their murders, closed one chapter but opened new questions and created new pain for the Rodriguez family and the Greenfield community. Robert, Maria, and Thomas Rodriguez were interviewed extensively by media in the weeks following the discovery. They spoke carefully, balancing their desire for privacy against the public's interest in a case that had captivated central Pennsylvania for a decade. "We're grateful to finally have them home," Maria told a reporter from the Harrisburg Tribune. "For 10 years, we didn't know where our parents were. We couldn't visit them. We couldn't say goodbye. Now we can. That's something." But gratitude was mixed with rage. "Someone took our parents from us," Robert said in the same interview. "Someone killed them on what should have been one of the happiest days of their lives. They were going to celebrate 50 years of marriage. Instead, they were murdered and buried, like they were nothing." The knowledge that they'd been so close, buried less than 2 miles from where their car was found, intensified the pain. The property had been searched in 2014. Investigators had walked Morrison's farm, looked in his barn and outbuildings. But they hadn't searched thoroughly enough. They hadn't dug. They hadn't suspected Morrison of being capable of murder. "If we'd found them then," Thomas said quietly, "maybe we could have had closure sooner. Maybe Morrison would have faced justice before he died. But we'll never know." Emily and David Rodriguez were buried together on April 7, 2024, in a double plot at St. Mary's Cemetery in Greenfield, not far from where they'd been married 60 years earlier. The funeral was attended by hundreds: family, friends, former students of David's, former patients and colleagues of Emily's, people from the community who'd followed their story for a decade. The coffins were closed. After 10 years in the ground, the remains were not suitable for viewing. But photographs of Emily and David at their wedding, at various anniversaries, with their children and grandchildren, surrounded the caskets. Robert, Maria, and Thomas each spoke about their parents, about the love Emily and David had shared, about the legacy they'd left. "Our parents taught us that marriage is a partnership," Maria said through tears. "That love means choosing each other every day, supporting each other, being each other's best friend. They lived that for 50 years. And even in death, even after everything that was done to them, they were together. Whoever buried them understood that they belonged together. Even a murderer could see that." The investigation into Harold Morrison continued after his death, trying to understand who he'd been and why he might have killed Emily and David Rodriguez. Detectives interviewed neighbors, reviewed his life history, consulted with criminal psychologists about his profile. What emerged was the portrait of a troubled man. Morrison had grown up poor in rural Pennsylvania, dropped out of school at 16 to work on his family's farm. He'd married young, had 2 children who'd both moved away as soon as they were adults, and had minimal contact with him afterward. His wife had died in 2008, and by all accounts their marriage had been unhappy. Morrison had a history of financial problems, poor decisions, bad luck, and sometimes just bad character. The 2014 foreclosure threat wasn't his first. He'd nearly lost the farm twice before. He drank heavily, though never quite enough to be labeled an alcoholic by medical standards. He had a temper, evidenced by the assault charge and numerous neighbor complaints. But nothing in his background screamed murderer. He'd lived 75 years without killing anyone as far as investigators could determine. Emily and David Rodriguez appeared to be his only victims, a crime of opportunity by a desperate man who made a terrible choice and then had to live with it for 8 years until his own death. Forensic evidence supported the theory, but couldn't prove it absolutely. The blood in Morrison's barn was consistent with Emily and David's blood types, though specific DNA analysis was complicated by degradation. The trauma patterns on their skulls were consistent with being struck by a weapon similar to tools found in Morrison's barn. The timeline matched. Morrison had been home the afternoon of September 13th, 2014. The location matched. Morrison's property was the closest to where the car was found. But there was no confession, no witness, no definitive smoking gun. If Morrison had still been alive, prosecutors acknowledged they might not have had enough evidence to convict him beyond reasonable doubt. But Morrison was dead, so the case was closed with the notation that Harold Morrison was the primary suspect in the murders of Emily and David Rodriguez. The question of why the bodies had been positioned in an embrace would never be answered definitively. Forensic psychologists who reviewed the case offered several theories. Some suggested it indicated Morrison had recognized Emily, and David were a couple, perhaps had seen their formal attire and wedding rings, and some vestige of conscience made him want to preserve their togetherness even as he buried them. Others noted it might have been purely practical. Positioning bodies close together, even overlapping, meant digging a smaller grave, requiring less time and effort when Morrison would have been working quickly to hide his crime. The most compelling theory came from Dr. Ellen Martinez, a criminal psychologist who'd studied violent offenders for 30 years. The positioning could have been Morrison's way of compartmentalizing, she explained. By arranging the bodies deliberately, almost ceremonially, he transformed the act from "I murdered two people" to "I'm burying these bodies properly." It's a psychological distancing mechanism. The more methodical and careful the burial, the less it feels like a panicked response to murder, and the more it feels like a controlled, intentional act. This can help perpetrators justify their actions to themselves. Whatever his reasons, the image of Emily and David's remains positioned in that eternal embrace became the defining image of the case. Photographs of the excavation site, heavily redacted to protect the dignity of the deceased, circulated in media coverage. The detail that they'd been buried holding each other resonated with people around the country. The story became about more than murder. It became about love, about devotion, about couples who remain partners even unto death. Emily and David Rodriguez became symbols of enduring love. Their 50-year marriage cut short but not diminished. Their final resting position a testimony to their bond. "My parents would have wanted to be together," Robert said in a television interview months after the funeral. "If they had to die, if this terrible thing had to happen to them, at least they died together. At least they were never alone." That's what marriage meant to them. Being together. Always. The Rodriguez children established a foundation in their parents' names, supporting elderly safety programs and cold case investigations. They funded scholarships for nursing and teaching students. They organized an annual memorial walk in Greenfield, raising money for victims' families, and search and rescue operations. The house on Maple Street was finally sold in 2025. Robert couldn't maintain it anymore, and the family agreed it was time. A young couple with children bought it, drawn by the neighborhood and the good schools, unaware of the tragedy connected to the address until after closing. When they learned the history, they considered backing out, but ultimately stayed. "We'll honor their memory by filling this house with love again," the new owners said. Harold Morrison's farm was cleared by Michael Carson's development company. The barn where Emily and David had likely been killed was torn down. The wooded area where they'd been buried was left untouched, designated as a conservation easement that would never be developed. A simple stone marker was placed there with the inscription, "In memory of Emily and David Rodriguez. Together, always." So what really happened on September 13th, 2014? We know most of it now. Emily and David Rodriguez left their home to celebrate 50 years of marriage. They had car trouble, or stopped for some reason on County Road 47. They encountered Harold Morrison, a desperate man with a history of violence. Morrison saw an opportunity for robbery, or simply reacted with rage to some perceived slight. He attacked them, killed them, and buried them on his property. Then Harold Morrison went back to his life. He faced foreclosure eventually, but managed to keep his farm. He lived alone for 8 more years, declining in health and isolation, until his heart gave out in October 2022. He never confessed, never showed remorse, never gave any indication that he carried the weight of having murdered 2 innocent people. Did he think about Emily and David over those 8 years? Did he walk past the wooded area where they were buried and feel guilt? Or had he compartmentalized it, pushed it into some locked room in his mind where he didn't have to acknowledge what he'd done? We'll never know. Morrison's secrets died with him. All we have is evidence, theory, and the terrible finality of those 2 skeletons positioned in each other's arms beneath Pennsylvania soil. Emily and David Rodriguez were married for 50 years and 13 days. They spent 10 years buried together before being found. They rest now in St. Mary's Cemetery, their headstone reading, "Emily Marie Rodriguez, 1946, 2014. David James Rodriguez, 1943, 2014. Beloved parents and grandparents. Together in life, together in death, together forever. Their story reminds us that evil exists, that violence can strike anywhere, that even the most innocent journey can end in tragedy. But it also reminds us that love endures, that the bonds we form matter, that even a murderer recognized that Emily and David belonged together. The image of those skeletal hands intertwined, preserved for 10 years in the darkness before being brought into the light, became a powerful symbol. It was shared millions of times on social media, discussed in think pieces about love and marriage, referenced in sermons and wedding toasts and anniversary celebrations. Emily and David Rodriguez didn't choose how their story ended. That choice was stolen from them by a violent man in a moment of rage or greed. But the way they lived, the love they shared, the 50 years they spent as partners, that was their choice. And that's what endures. Rest in peace, Emily and David Rodriguez. You deserved 50 more years together. You deserved to celebrate your anniversary, to dance to your song, to grow even older together, surrounded by the family who loved you. Instead, you were taken too soon in a cruel and senseless way. But you were together, in life and in death, and now in memory. Always together. And that, perhaps, is something.